So let's talk about a man named Maximilien Robespierre. On the one hand, they called him the Incorruptible. He was a champion for the poor, a guy who absolutely hated the death penalty. But on the other hand, his name is now basically synonymous with the guillotine and the Reign of Terror. We're going to dive into the story of this man, full of shocking contradictions, and try to understand one of the most terrifying transformations in all of history.
Early on in his career as a lawyer, Robespierre was totally against capital punishment. He was passionate about it. He argued that the state has absolutely no right to take a human life. He thought the whole practice was just abhorrent. So picture that, a man of principle, a total idealist. You got to remember that as we go on.
Because, get this, that same man would later be the one heading up the Committee of Public Safety. And that committee, that was the engine of the Reign of Terror. We're talking about a period where more than 17,000 people were officially sent to the guillotine. And that's not even counting the tens of thousands more who died in prisons or massacres. It's just a staggering number.
So there it is. That's the central question, isn't it? How does a man who hated the death penalty become the literal face of the guillotine? What on earth could cause a person to change that much, to make such a horrifying U-turn? Well, to even begin to understand this, we have to rewind. We've got to go back and look at the man before all the chaos, We need to see what experiences shaped him, what forged this rigid, unbending character he was known for. Robespierre's childhood was, well, it was just plain traumatic. His mother died, his father couldn't handle it, and just left, abandoned the family. So at just 8 years old, Maximilien had to become the man of the house. He was forced into this serious, responsible role. For him, being responsible and orderly, that wasn't just about being a good kid. It was about survival. And this is where we get into his psychology a bit. Some historians, psychohistorians they're called, they argued that this trauma from his childhood, it left him with this deep, lifelong feeling of guilt. And that guilt created this desperate need to force order onto a chaotic world. And that personal need for order, it would eventually scale up to become his vision for the entirety of France. So when he got into politics, people noticed this intensity right away. A fellow revolutionary, a guy named Mirabeau, saw it crystal clear. Robespierre, he wasn't some smooth, charismatic speaker, but his conviction, it was absolute. He had this almost frightening sincerity. The kind that makes you either want to follow a person to the ends of the earth or run in the other direction.
And at the beginning, his ideas were really progressive for the time. He was arguing for the poor, demanding that all men get the right to vote, pushing for a totally free press. And because he just would not compromise on these ideals, that's how he earned his famous nickname, the Incorruptible. He was, for all intents and purposes, the moral compass of the revolution.
Okay, but this is where everything starts to shift. Because it's one thing to be an idealist when things are calm, right? But what happens when your entire country is fighting for its very survival? Well, those principles get tested, and sometimes they get twisted.
And you have to understand, France was in a state of absolute total crisis. You had foreign armies invading from literally all sides, all of them wanting to just crush this new revolution. And inside France, it was maybe even worse. Major cities were in open rebellion. A massive, brutal civil war broke out in a region called the Vendée. The revolution was literally on the verge of being strangled in its crib.
All this pressure just shattered the unity of the revolutionaries. So you basically ended up with two main camps. On one side, you had the Girondins. They were a bit more moderate, believed in free markets, and kind of wanted to export the revolution by starting wars. Then you had Robespierre and his group, the Jacobins. They were way more radical. They thought the real danger came from traitors inside France, and that the government had to centralize its power and even control the price of bread to keep the people from starving.
And this quote right here, it perfectly captures Robespierre's focus at the time. He argued like crazy against the Girondins' plan to go to war. He warned them, and he was totally right in hindsight, that you just can't force your ideals on other countries at the point of a gun. He was absolutely convinced the real danger was already inside the gates.
So you take that belief that the enemy is within, and you mix it with his super rigid idealism, and then you add the immense pressure of war. And what do you get? You get a terrifying new philosophy, a kind of logic that would end up justifying the absolutely unthinkable.
Okay, so the philosophical key that unlocks all of this comes from a thinker named Rousseau. It's this idea called the general will. The concept is pretty simple. For a republic to be good, to be virtuous, and to survive, everyone has to be united in a single shared purpose. Now think about what that means. If the will of the nation is supposed to be one single thing, then anyone who disagrees, well, they're not just offering a different opinion, they're committing treason.
And here is the exact terrifying logic of how that philosophy turned into policy. It's a step-by-step process. Step 1. The Republic is under attack. Okay. Step 2. We need to be completely unified to survive. Makes sense. Step 3. Therefore, any dissent is actually treason. And that leads to the final, horrifying conclusion. Step 4. Terror isn't just an option. It is a necessary tool. It's what you use to purge the traitors and force everyone to be virtuous enough to save the nation.
Now, this is why a lot of historians don't look at the terror as just random, senseless violence. They argue it was a brutal, yes, but also a logical reaction to the very real threats that France was facing. It was like this desperate, panicked reflex, an action designed to get rid of enemies and force unity at a time when the whole country was literally falling apart.
You know, we all have this image in our heads of the Reign of Terror, right? It's all fancy aristocrats being marched to the guillotine, but the actual numbers, they tell a completely different story. Just look at this. The nobility and the clergy, they were only a tiny fraction of the victims. The vast majority, a whopping 72%, were regular people, peasants and artisans, accused of things like hoarding food, deserting the army, or taking part in rebellions.
And that right there just reinforces this idea of a military logic behind it all. See, the executions weren't happening randomly all over France. They were heavily concentrated in the war zones, the places where foreign armies were invading and where the civil wars were raging, like in the Vendée and those other cities in revolt. The guillotine was basically being used as a weapon of war.
But here's the thing about a machine like the Terror. It's always hungry. Once you start pointing fingers and purging enemies, it's almost impossible to know when to stop. And, well, eventually, the revolution came for its own creator.
And when the end came, it came fast. Robespierre was getting more and more paranoid. He was clearly exhausted. He gets up and gives this really clumsy, threatening speech. He hints that he has a new list of traitors, but he doesn't name any names. Well, you can imagine what happened. Everyone in the room got terrified, thinking, am I on that list? So they all united against him. The very next day, they shout him down with the tyrant! They arrest him, and after a failed suicide attempt, he's sent to the very same guillotine that became his symbol.
The irony in his final moments is just chilling. Think about this. As the cart is taking him to be executed, it passes by the simple house where he lived. And the crowd that's gathered, they aren't shouting about liberty or ideals. They're shouting, down with the maximum. They were protesting the price controls on bread that he put in place, the very policy he thought would help them.
And this brings us full circle, right back to his childhood. Remember that theory about his psychology? Some historians argue that his inaction right at the end, his inability to save himself, was almost like a death wish. Maybe it was the final surrender of a man whose entire life was a battle against his own inner chaos, a battle driven by that primal guilt from when he was just a boy.
So, what's the verdict? Who was this man? Was he a monster, born out of the chaos of revolution, who used a crisis to let his tyrannical side run wild? Or was he a tragic idealist, so desperate to save his dream of a perfect republic that he became the very monster he always claimed to despise? That's the question, and that is the haunting, complicated legacy of Maximilien Robespierre,